Hager is an analyst and a former correspondent for NBC News. He was a combat correspondent during the Vietnam War and covered the Cold War from Berlin and Moscow. For 25 years, he worked out of Washington, D.C. Among the most important stories he covered were the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the loss of the space shuttles Challenger and Columbia, the bombing of a Pan American Airlines flight over Lockerbie in Scotland, the crash of the supersonic Concorde on takeoff from Paris, and the bombing of the Federal Building in Oklahoma City. During the latter part of his career, he was best known for disaster coverage. He reported from the scene of more than 40 major aviation accidents and broadcast live from nearly 30 hurricanes. I guess we're really lucky he's standing here tonight. Other stories he covered include the massacre of the Israeli team at the 1972 Munich Olympics, sectarian strife in Northern Ireland, the bloody revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran, and the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. For 3 decades, Hager consistently ranked among the top US network news reporters based on frequency of appearances on the evening news. In a magazine interview, NBC anchor Tom Brokaw said, "When I name my all-time all-star team, he will be on the first string." He won 2 national Emmys, 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards, and a National Headliner Prize. A graduate of Dartmouth College, he retired to his hometown of Woodstock, Vermont in 2004. Please help me welcome Mr. Hager.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming tonight. Thank you, Frankie, for that very nice introduction, and David for your words, and thanks to the Ilsley Public Library for hosting this event, and to the Vermont Humanities Council for inviting me to speak. And thank you, everybody, as I say, for coming out tonight. As Frankie said, during much of my career, I was known for covering disasters. I want to start off tonight by telling you about one time when I actually caused a disaster rather than covering one. It was not a full-scale disaster, but kind of a minor disaster, for me anyway. It was on the occasion of taking up my first post in the old Soviet Union in 1970. And to understand the story, the foreign correspondents in Moscow were confined for their offices and apartments to this big high-rise building that was surrounded by a guarded fence. They didn't want you fraternizing with Soviet citizens. And so we were in this building in the NBC apartment. The office was on the ground floor. The apartment was on the 5th floor. Now, this was the height of the Cold War, so I knew going out, these people are going to be eavesdropping me, following me. And so I thought, since I'm from electronic media, I ought to be sophisticated enough to find the listening device in my apartment, the bug. So I set out and looked. The most obvious place first would be the mouthpiece of the telephone. I unscrewed it, looked inside, but there was no bug. After looking a couple of other obvious places and not finding the bug, I started tapping on the wall, because other correspondents had told me that oftentimes when they had replastered, and indeed the apartment had been replastered, that they'd hide a microphone in that plaster, and if you tapped on the plaster, you could discern a hollow spot where the microphone would be. So I tapped on the wall, but no hollow spot that I could find. And then I saw on the floor this round brass plate screwed down. Looked like it might be an outlet below it or something like that. I thought, gee, that'd be a great place to hide a bug. I'll bet it's there. So I got a screwdriver and I unscrewed this brass thing. And as I lifted it up, there was a crash as the chandelier in the apartment below mine fell to the floor. Broke into 100 pieces. Soviets were not happy with me. So that was a mini disaster for me anyway. So you know where I'm going tonight? Yep, sure.
Check
yep, that's not working. Here. All right.
Okay, and just let me pull out the thing from your pocket just to...
In case it's not on or something.
It's on. It is.
No, I'm in trouble.
Listening devices.
Want to try this? This is for the camera back there. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Hello, hello, hello. 1, 2.
I'm sorry.
Yeah?
Hello, this is Nada. Okay.
A pause.
Is this?
Ah. But is that going to make feedback now?
That shouldn't. Yeah.
Oh, that's our microphone for here. So this one is for the camera?
Yeah. That's the camera
Okay.
here. This
All right.
is
I told you, I know microphones. So you know where I'm going tonight. I thought I'd tell this story autobiographically because it's easiest. But as I go along, I'll have interesting yarns and make a point or two about some of the events that I covered, and also the evolution of news, which has changed dramatically from the time I first joined back in the days of Huntley Brinkley. I was raised in Woodstock. I knew very early on that I wanted to be a newsman or a broadcaster. I'd had an earache in the 5th grade and was confined to bed for much of one summer, and I listened to the radio all the time. Fell in love with the newscasts and the sportscasts, and I said, boy, that's what I want to do. And it helped a lot because when I was in high school, I sent away for a manual on how to write news, and I went around town and did interviews with people and made a little mock newscast and write it up, and then I would broadcast it in my bedroom into the tape recorder and listen back to the tape recorder. So it was good training, and by the time I got my driver's license when I was 16, I was able to convert that into jobs writing news for local stations here. So I first in a station in Springfield, Vermont, and later that summer, I'm still in high school, but this is summers and vacations, then down to Brattleboro, Vermont. Rutland, I spent a lot of time with a station there. It's off the air now, but the old WHWB. And then when I went on to Dartmouth, I was at our college station. I was the news and sports director of the college radio station there. And that let me broadcast the play-by-play, too, of the football, the hockey, and the basketball. Actually, we came over here. We did a game from a hockey match from Middlebury in 1958, so 52 years ago. And one summer, before I left Dartmouth, the summer before my senior year, I worked up the road there at WCAX in Burlington. It was my first taste of television. And I actually was able to get on the air on the weekends doing the weather and wrote commercials during the week. And when the weatherman, Stuart Hall at that time, went away for 2 weeks, then I got to substitute for him, and I was on every night. So that was a great experience. Then I went off after college. It's sort of like baseball. You work your way up through the minor leagues. So I worked for local stations. Actually, I did do 2 years of minor league baseball, and that had taken me down into the Deep South. So it was a first exposure to the Deep South, the Jim Crow laws of the 1960s. And I covered a lot of civil rights, and they were exciting and inspiring stories. That was a great experience. So all this time I knew I really wanted to be covering national news and be with a network. And my break came when I was 30 years old, 9 years out of college, when I got my job with NBC. But the trade-off was that they said, you've got to go to Vietnam if you want to work with us. Well, I had 3 kids at that point. My wife and I had been married my senior year in college. She's from Rutland, by the way, so we're both Vermonters. And I was not anxious to go to Vietnam. But I realized, I then went to AB, I was working at an NBC affiliate, so NBC was the one that offered the job. Went to ABC and CBS and said, how about a job? And they said, well, yeah, we know your work and we like it, but you've got to go to Vietnam first. So I realized that I was not going to get out of that. Well, later, the punchline is that I'm awfully glad that I went, because it is, as has been said, the first war that television brought into the living rooms of Americans. It was a terribly important moment for journalism. As a journalist of my era, I would not have wanted to miss that. And one thing I learned very early on going out there is that things are never as you imagine them. That's one of the advantages of being a journalist, is that when you're on the front lines or out covering the story on the scene, it's never like you imagine from the research and reading, and no matter how you prepare, nothing like seeing something firsthand. And so when I went out, I was a product of the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, and they told us we got to draw a line in the sand against communism, prevent the advance. And I went out a hawk. And after I'd been there a bit, I turned into a dove because, now I say hawk and dove, you keep these opinions out of your broadcasting and try to keep that as neutral as you can. But inside I thought, gee, this is not working. We don't belong here. We're not going to win this war. Just to give you a flavor of it, now let's see if I can operate this equipment.
Okay, you want to point it over here.
Oh, point it there, okay. There we go.
Okay,
All
then you
right.
go there, and then just enter.
And enter. And we'll try to, yeah it is, there we go.
So far, this month of October, there has been no main force enemy threat in General Bennett's area. But his own figures show of 58 fights with the enemy, all but 4 were started by our side. 190 enemy were killed in those fights, and this is not considered a hot operating area. So while there has been some scaling down, from here it looks a long way from a ceasefire. Robert Hager, NBC News, with the 199th Infantry.
Well, that's just to give you an idea of what it looked like over there and what I looked like when I was 30 years old. But they made us wear fatigues, by the way. That was a rule. If you were going to be operating with U.S. forces, they wanted us to wear the fatigues so we wouldn't stand out. I want to pause here for a moment before I show you a couple of pieces from Vietnam, just to talk about war coverage in general, because I think people don't really realize this, but our rules for coverage in Vietnam were looser, more liberal, less restrictive than any war since that American journalists have covered. I think it's because there wasn't television in the Korean War, or at least it wasn't a daily kind of thing. And so we were kind of making up the rules as they went along, the military. Consequently, there really were no rules. And we were free to go where we wanted to, travel where we wanted to, say what we wanted to. And most important, I think, is this idea, the later wars, first they tried pool coverage, and then in the recent wars they've done embedded coverage where the journalists are, they train with the troops and they sleep with them, eat with them, and then go out. And it does give them access to the very front lines. But I think it gives you a mindset where you lose your perspective and your neutrality. You become sort of like a GI. And I think it's important for a journalist to try to take a step back and look at it from a broader perspective. And I have a piece to show that, an example of how we could be very critical sometimes. This is a day when I was operating with U.S. forces in a tracked vehicle. There were about 15 GIs and commander. They're accompanied by South Vietnamese, that's our side, guides, 2 guides who play a role in this story. And we took some fire from a tree line across a pasture, and a couple of brave combat troops jumped out of the tracked vehicle and just advanced on the tree line, firing as they went, and it worked. They flushed out 4 or 5 Viet Cong, communist Vietnamese prisoners coming out with their hands up. So this is what transpired after that. And this is not easy to look at, actually. But you see these POWs get beat up very badly with the American forces looking on and doing nothing to stop it. And then I held the film before I sent it back to the States, took it back to Saigon so I could go to the briefing and ask at the daily briefing what the policy is about treatment of POWs, just sort of to demonstrate the hypocrisy of it. Now let's see if I can make it roll again. This is Brinkley.
Okay, well, focus it over here.
Oh yeah, there. All right.
You
You see
Do the S.
the S. All right.
Okay.
And up.
And go
Now
down.
I got to go down 1. All right. Thank you for the help. Oh, I got to.
And then
Okay, and now we go. All right. Let's hope. David Brinkley.
Viet Cong had been something less than humane in letting American relatives know what prisoners they hold alive. Lately, they've promised to do better, but as yet it is only a promise and not performance. The Americans in Vietnam do not hold prisoners. Anyone they capture, they turn over to South Vietnam, and the treatment then is up to them. 2 suspected Viet Cong were taken during an American operation in a rice field near Cu Chi.
The men who handled the prisoners were Vietnamese translators on special assignment to the U.S. Army, and clearly under U.S. authority and command. The Americans, including a major and a lieutenant colonel, were embarrassed by our camera, but made no move to stop the beating. Everyone here knows this sort of treatment of prisoners when they are first taken is not uncommon. In Saigon, a U.S. command briefer, unaware of the incident, outlined what is supposed to be military policy on treatment of suspects.
Persons who are detained by U.S. forces in the field are granted the same humane treatment which is authorized and required by the Geneva Convention for all prisoners of war. This prohibits acts of violence or intimidation, any insults or any public curiosity, and precludes their being paraded through the streets and things like this.
Allow any form of physical abuse when they're captured?
Yes, this does rule out physical abuse.
But it is well known that policy is frequently overlooked under combat conditions. Robert Hager, NBC News at Crew Chief.
So, I hate for that title because Tehran is misspelled, but that was the engineer who put the tape together for I know how to spell Tehran. But my thought about that piece is that if I were had been embedded, the commander was very embarrassed that we had that footage. He said, "Oh, that's some number 10 film you got there." If I had been embedded, this would be somebody I know, is a good friend now, and he might have said, "Bob, you know, that doesn't happen very often," which is not true. You shouldn't really show that. The American people won't understand that. Can't you just lose that film? And if I were embedded and part of that group, you know, maybe I'd somehow think for the greater good that it was the best thing, just lose that footage. But because I wasn't embedded, it never occurred to me. I thought, you got to show that in fact war is not pretty, that these kinds of things happen all the time in war. Second point about Vietnamese coverage is that we had Vietnamese camera crews and sound crews. And that was important because it freed me up to cover the Vietnamese people, because they could serve as translators and guides. So if I were operating with the U.S. troops with my Vietnamese crew, and I wanted to leave the troops and go into the village and be on my own, first they could advise me, because they had a sixth sense for it, about the safety of going into the village without troops. And second, once I got there, they could introduce me to people. They'd give me a feel for how that village was faring and what they thought of the war and so forth. So here's a piece I did. This time the anchor is Huntley, Chet Huntley, about a village, but it demonstrates what you could do, what I was able to do because of this crew. I gotta go down one. Sorry about this. One more. Why is it not going down? There it goes. All right.
There are hundreds of villages like Tu Kung in South Vietnam where hundreds of civilians may have been massacred. They're places whose people have to make the hard choice between one side or the other, and often they're quite literally caught in the middle.
This is the village of An Tin, 30 miles from Saigon, where our side and the Viet Cong compete on equal terms. Most of the young men are away with the South Vietnamese Army or with the Viet Cong. Physical evidence of the war abounds in An Tin. Many homes have been hit by American artillery and riddled by bullets from both sides. Every straw hut has the equivalent of a bomb shelter. When the villagers hear shooting at night, they crawl inside. Some of the farmers of An Tin still work the fields, but others have given up for fear they will be shot. American troops operate through An Tin frequently. Sometimes they round up the people for questioning. But the villagers don't talk because those who do will have to answer by night to the Viet Cong. popular Vietnamese ballad says, "For 1,000 years we were slaves to the Chinese. For 100 years we were dominated by the French. Now, for 20 years, we have been fighting each other. We leave a sad Vietnam to our sons." Robert Hager, NBC News at An Thien Village.
One other thought about war before I leave Vietnam. I mentioned the importance of seeing things firsthand, and war close up is, as I say, it's not pretty. It's pretty horrible. And there's no way to prevent innocent people from getting caught in the crossfire. When I went out to Vietnam, there were 300 U.S. kids alone being killed a week. That was about the highest point of the toll in 1969, early in 69. But also, how many Vietnamese, women and children. I saw these kids in Saigon who were maimed and wounded by bombs and by mines with no amputees. Just pitiful stuff. And I think what it says to me is that there is no clean way to fight a war. Lots of innocents get caught in the crossfire, and it just makes me believe that a nation has to think long and hard before they get into a war or decide that it's worth a war, only because of these innocent casualties that are the inevitable result of war. Well, enough about that. Vietnam was sort of a trial for me, and based on my stories, the editors thought I'd done a good job, and I want a permanent job with NBC. And my next assignment was the Cold War, and I operated out of bureaus in West Berlin and in Moscow. About 2/3 of the time in West Berlin, where my family and kids stayed, and then about 1/3 of my time in Moscow. It was a strange and spooky time in the communist world. They used to follow me all the time. I'd catch them outside our apartment and this compound in Moscow. There was a nearby subway station and an escalator that went deep into the ground of the subway. And just for the heck of it, I'd go down and ride the escalator down. And at the bottom, the up escalator was exactly parallel to the down escalator. So I'd turn around at the bottom instead of going for the subway and ride the escalator up, turning around to look down. And sure enough, some little distance behind me, one or two others would make the same U-turn, and I'd know that they were following me. I got expelled from Poland. It was 10 years before the rise of Solidarity and Lech Walesa, but I was doing a story on, I was doing a story in Gdansk when suddenly there were anti-communist riots and work stoppages at the shipyard. And I was alone there for a Western reporter, and so I filed stories on it for a couple of days in a row until the Polish government really caught on to what was going on. And I woke up one morning at the hotel, took a little walk outside, and there were six guys on my tail. And an hour or so later, they called me in and said, "You're expelled, you got to leave." At the airport, a guy had given me a note, one of the protesters, to send to his brother in Buffalo, bragging about how he'd been in the anti-communist riots. And I knew they were going to find that letter, so before they found it, I managed to get it out, and I ate his name off the bottom. So the agents who were fleecing me at the airport wouldn't be able to trace it back to who had written the letter. But back in Moscow, one of the best stories is being arrested. It wasn't too serious an arrest, but my wife, as I say, had stayed in West Berlin. And I thought before I go back, I do need to bring her out here to Moscow so she can see what this part of the world is like. And I was showing her the Moscow around our apartment. And there was, among other things, an outdoor market that was the most colorful place. And these old women coming up from the Ukraine selling their vegetables and with the babushkas and had shawls. And I'm taking brownie pictures of this with a tourist camera. And as I'm taking the pictures, my wife said to me, I don't think you're supposed to be taking pictures like that here. And I said, honey, I've been coming here for 3 years, off and on. And I said, I know the rules. If it was a railroad station or something strategic, no, I couldn't take pictures. But a market, no problem. I no sooner finished saying that than there was whomp, this hand on my shoulder. And I turned around, and here's a great big militiaman, means a cop, dripping with ribbons. Come with me, господин. So he took my wife and I, put us in the militia car, and we're going to the police station. And en route, I said, honey, there's no problem here. They can't. I said, this is outrageous. I said, I know how to deal with the Russians, too. And I said, they buckle when you yell at them long enough and hard enough. They'll buckle. And I said, so when I get to the police station, I'm going to pound on the table and say, this is an outrage. I want my ambassador. Now, the kids are back in Berlin. My wife is positive we're both going to Siberia for the rest of our lives. And she says, I told you not to take those pictures. Said, when we get to the police station, you fold your hands and you just keep your mouth shut. I know how to stay married. I did exactly that. And after a couple of hours, they handed the camera back and said, "Fotoapparat niet, don't take any more pictures." And that was it. Well, in line with making some observations as I go along, one thing, when I went out to the Soviet Union, I imagined them as the world's other great power, the two superpowers in those days, the U.S. and the Soviets. And I was so shocked when I got there. Yes, they were a superpower in military. I mean, they had missiles and they had nuclear weapons, so we were right to arm ourselves against that, and it was a huge military threat. But on the other side of it, consumerism and taking care of their people, human rights and basic everyday freedoms. I mean, it was so medieval, and they were so far behind even bloc countries like Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia, so far behind even those countries. A few miles out of Moscow, there was no running water, no electricity. So it's my opinion that empire crumbled of its own ineptitude. And I think nowadays a lot of scholars say it was U.S. resolve, and Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. My own opinion is that it was just inevitable. That thing was going to collapse from within. They had brave leaders, Lech Walesa in Poland, certainly extremely courageous, and Gorbachev in Moscow, who never intended to overthrow the Communist Party, but simply wanted to reform the Communist Party. Those people were very, very important. But otherwise, I believe that it was just inevitable that this was going to happen. And the system was so repressive and so morally bankrupt. And so it came down. I am my clicker. Thank you very much. I knew something fell. Some other major foreign stories I covered, as Frankie said, the terrorist attack on the Munich Olympics, in South America, the mass cyanide poisoning at Jonestown in South America. I wasn't there actually when it came down, but I did aftermath about a week after that, and I went out and visited Jonestown, did a story on, they had one American kid there that they put on trial in Guyana. A terrible story. But I want to fast forward to the next big story that I want to talk about is the revolution in Iran, 1979. This is when the Shah was forced to flee and the Islamic fundamentalists finally, in the end, took over. But I had been a history major at Dartmouth. I always loved history, particularly revolutions. And I'd studied the anatomy of the American Revolution, French Revolution, Soviet Revolution. Well, here was a revolution that really came up from the grassroots. The Shah had big, powerful army and all these modern weapons, but he was hated in his own country. 98% of the people were against him, including all the middle class. And this thing just came up from the grassroots. And it began with demonstrations and strikes and closing down the businesses. And finally, the whole country was not functioning. And then the enlisted people, the demonstrators, would go over and put a flower in their rifle butt. They're lining the streets as the demonstrators marched. And the first day, the Iranian soldiers would take the flowers out of their rifles and throw them down on the ground. And after a couple of days, they leave the flowers in there, or they even put down their rifles and join the march, because after all, they're enlisted people. They were like the rest of the Iranians. And then the Shah lost the officer corps even, and the whole thing crumbled. It was the most dangerous story I ever covered. Now, let's see, I got to get the titles up, and then come down. All right. This just sort of puts me at the scene.
For evening, scores of small fires still burn, barricading streets through much of the city's poorer south side. So the government has chosen to get tough with the demonstrators, but the question some are asking here is how long the government can survive this trouble in the streets. Robert Hager, NBC News, Tehran.
So I say, this was the most dangerous story I ever covered. In Vietnam, you could travel with the U.S. troops. You had firepower at your back, or if you were traveling sometimes with the Vietnamese army, a South Vietnamese army, you had firepower at your back. In Iran, the Shah's regime was against foreign reporters being there, thought that we had to do with fomenting the revolution, which we didn't. But at any rate, they resented our presence. It was unsafe to be with the Shah's army, so you had to really be with the demonstrators, who sort of tolerated us. But it did get, as I say, very dangerous. Here's an example of a particularly bloody day. We were filming this, we'll see this pitched battle in the streets, and we were filming it from a balcony looking down on the battle. Menu first. Menu I got. There we go.
More than 30
Jessica Savage.
killed and hundreds wounded today in one of Iran's worst riots. Soldiers in central Tehran opened fire on anti-government demonstrators. Robert Hager reports.
It was the second time in 3 days that troops had opened fire against demonstrators in Tehran. As was the case last Friday, the trouble today was centered around Tehran University. Some say provincial police fired the first shots to clear unauthorized demonstrators from the streets. The crowd built fires. Others threw rocks at the troops. The troops answered with volley after volley, some shots into the air, but many more shots directly into the crowd. A man on the sidewalk appealed to a soldier to hold his fire. The soldier kicked him and hit him. Several blocks away, angry demonstrators wrestled from his car a man they believed to be an agent of the Iranian secret police. The car was set afire. Troops tried to clear the square, but time after time the demonstrators surged back out onto the streets, shouting death to Bakhtiar and death to American imperialism. One soldier was shot, and demonstrators carried him from the street. Some said the soldier had been shot by his own troops for trying to help a demonstrator. There was another report that an army officer had been killed by his troops after ordering them to fire. Robert Hager, NBC News, Tehran.
By the end of that day, there were 30 dead as a result of that rioting in the streets. A reporter colleague of mine was killed that day, Joe Alex Morris. I had been with him in Moscow. He wrote for the Los Angeles Times, and he was killed by a bullet from the Iranian army. It's sad to me today that that country is still in the same kind of turmoil, and it's back in the streets, and the chapter is open. I mean, we don't really know where it's going. It's interesting to me that like so many revolutions, this one ended in an overreaction at the end that led to this terrible, repressive Islamic fundamentalist regime. So as I say, we don't know where it's going. Well, all this has been from the first third of my career. The second two-thirds of my career were not quite as many datelines. I was moved to the States, and I spent a lot of my time in Washington. I'd always wanted to be in Washington. That's where the bosses sit in New York, but a field troop on the networks, Washington is where the news is at. I was surprised when I got sent to Washington. I thought with all that foreign experience, I'd immediately get a cream puff beat, it was its own hierarchy in Washington. The reporters who were already there, somebody was at White House, somebody at State Department, somebody at Justice, and somebody at Congress. So I had to kind of fend for myself. There was an aviation crisis going on at the time. All DC-10s had been grounded for a safety investigation. So I started with that, grabbed that. But my idea was to make a beat that was all consumer kind of things from Washington, because Washington not only is a center of politics, but all these agencies that do regulatory affairs and so forth are agencies that affect our daily lives. So I thought if you'd cover consumer affairs from a national standpoint and not like a local reporter where you're an advocate, 7 on your side, that kind of thing, but covered in a neutral fashion, things that touch people's lives. And it was a good decision because I liked the beat. I kept it later on when other beats opened up. And at the time I did it, no other network was doing it. Nowadays, they all have reporters assigned to these different agencies. But it was environment, the EPA. That gave me, I was our reporter at 3 Mile Island, and I was in charge of the Chernobyl coverage that we did. Climate change, I remember young Congressman Al Gore came to town and began holding these hearings in the House. And I'd tell my editors, geez, this is really important stuff, this climate change. And they'd say, climate what? You know, I was also new that this is middle 1980s. But also I became our go-to guy on disasters and things like that too. So I wound up, as Frankie said, I was at 40 different plane crashes, the bombing of the federal building at Oklahoma City and 9/11, and some 30 hurricanes. And speaking of hurricanes, I wanted to show you something. In the early days, before satellite trucks, to cover a hurricane live, you needed to get to the affiliate. It was the only place you could hook up for a live transmission. And that really restricted you in where you could be. You couldn't really be where the storm came in. When satellite trucks came along, it changed the whole nature of the thing. You could be right out on the coast or wherever the storm was coming in, and the satellite truck rolled right up to you with satellite in tow. Here's an example of one particular hurricane in 2003 in North Carolina. This is Hurricane Isabel, and the anchor is Tom Brokaw. Too far? Uh-oh. Got to stop it then. Stop. Thank you for catching it. All right, so now I need to go back to...
Yes.
Yeah, so... Start over again. That thing is not. Come on. One more. There we go. All right.
We have our correspondent stationed on Isabel's front lines tonight. We're going to begin with NBC's Robert Hager in North Carolina, which has been ground zero for Isabel. Bob?
See, the wind is still blowing here. We're actually on the backside of the storm at this point. The front side moved through here earlier today, not far from here, and it left in its wake tonight a lot of flooding and nearly 1 million people that we know of so far without power. And now the front end of it may go on to deal a glancing blow inland to Richmond and Washington, D.C.
Waves pounded the coastline relentlessly. Hour after hour, the wind raged. Blinding rain poured down. Those who stayed to ride it out were awed, like Mike Lowry.
Sounds like a freight train rolling through on a regular basis, but either that or a low-flying jet just coming right over the top of the house.
You hear a lot about storm surge. There behind me is storm surge. With Isabel very close now, its eye to come ashore just about 30 miles up the coastline. The dome of water in front being pushed into the shore because there's no place else to go, rolling in as those gigantic waves.
As the storm moved in, water piled up. People struggled to get through. Cars looked like speedboats. There was damage. Shingles blew away. A chunk of roof came off a motel. Police cleared an awning from a roadway. Trees toppled and electric lines came down. Ron and Stacy Oatman, stranded at home, watched a battery-powered TV.
You get kind of old, especially without power.
Lou and Jeanette Beebe played cards by the light of a lantern. He'd broken his pelvis putting up storm shutters and hadn't been well enough to evacuate.
I was scared to death when it was coming. And I don't think I slept more than a few hours for 3 nights.
Now, as the storm moves north, Washington, D.C. is bracing for a possible hit tonight. a temporary seawall erected along the Potomac River. The capital's subways and bus service shut down after morning rush hour. Airlines canceled 5,000 flights. The ripple effect caused long delays as far away as New York's LaGuardia Airport. And in Rhode Island, high seas pushed ahead of the storm led to the only reported death so far, a man swept away by a huge wave in Narragansett.
And although that flooding is bad, I don't think it's long-term flooding, not like the deadly sort of flooding we got after Hurricane Floyd in North Carolina 4 years ago. Not long-term because the hurricane moved through so fast that the amount of rain it deposited in any one place was not enough to really soak in as Floyd did 4 years ago. Tom?
So the logistics of that is that two things you got to do for these live shots is to protect the satellite, because if the satellite gets blown around by the wind too much, the dish, the transmission is spoiled and you're no good without being able to transmit. And in high enough wind it will. And you got to protect the camera because the water is not good for that camera lens. It'll drown it in a hurry. So the logistics of this, and they're typical, is that I'm out there on the edge of the beach. The crew is in a fairly substantial van, I'm going to guess about 15 feet from me, with the window of the van cracked and the lens of the camera sticking out the window, and the cord's coming to me. And then from the van back to the satellite truck to carry that picture and sound back to the truck is another, probably 100 yards or 150 yards back to the satellite truck. And you need to park the truck by a building where it can protect it from the wind. So you park it on the side that's not going to get the wind and hope that you can continue. And then interestingly, when the eye goes by, the wind shifts around. So you got to move the truck around to the other side of the motel. Anyway, I covered a lot of hurricanes, a lot of tornadoes, and a lot of blizzards, but one huge one was the biggest blizzard New England has seen in the last century. That was 1978. The epicenter was Rhode Island, but it closed down Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts pretty thoroughly. The governors of those three states sealed off the borders, closed the roads. The airports, of course, were closed. But we got into Providence, Rhode Island, on Amtrak, because the big engines could plow their way through, and made our way to the affiliate. 38 inches of snow in Rhode Island, just amazing. So we made our way from the railroad station to the local affiliate in snow up to here. And the storm had come on suddenly, so that it had caught people by surprise. Work let out at noon in Providence, and everybody fled in their cars. And immediately there was this huge traffic tie-up on the interstate, and nothing moved. Everybody had to abandon their cars. They were there for probably a week before they were able to dig them all out. So everybody went into town, and there were no hotel rooms or anything like that available because all the local people had them. But not to worry for us, because our affiliate happened to be in this huge department store. It was owned by the Outlet Company, which had a big department store in Providence, and the affiliate was up on the 5th floor. Meredith Vieira, by the way, was a local reporter there then, and reporting on that storm. So we'd cover the storm by day and come back to the affiliate, put it together. We used a helicopter mostly to cover. And then at night, we'd simply drop down to the 2nd floor, which was the bedding department, and spend the night in showcase beds. These last two-thirds of my career, those years, were also years of dramatic change that I lived through in the way television news is presented. So when I began, it was Huntley Brinkley. It was very serious. There were only 3 networks, divided up the audience among them. And the 3 networks regarded themselves pretty much as the newscasts of record. And we covered the entire half an hour mostly with hard news. Hard news, I mean events that happened that day or the day before and how they would affect people. Analysis, too, could be hard. But then, in the middle 1980s, I lay at the beginning of the change where the news lightened up to 2 different events that started in the 1980s. All 3 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, as I say, dominated the audience at the time. All 3 were bought by bottom-line corporations. In NBC's case, we were taken over by General Electric. In ABC's case, it was Cap Cities Broadcasting, which later gave way to Disney. And in CBS's case, it was the Tisch brothers, Lawrence Tisch in particular, which later was sold to Westinghouse and then Viacom. But the thing that all these new owners had in common was that they weren't used to broadcasting business. They were used to making money and profits, and they said the news has to show a profit. We had never shown profits. Our position was you had to operate news as a kind of a loss leader, and it's the only way you could do a good, honest job of covering it. And they said, no, you don't understand. If you don't make money, we're not going to do news. And so I mentioned two events. At the same time, cable was becoming an important player, and that meant CNN, later Fox News Cable, even MTV competing for eyes. I mean, the kids are controlling the sets to some extent. So there was a lot more competition than before. The audience was shrinking rapidly because it was going to these other sources. So you got two things going on at once. Make money, and meantime we're losing audience. And audience is important to the money because they take ratings, and based on the ratings, the advertisers determine the rate they're going to pay for the commercials. So it was important to try to hold on to audience. So they cut spending first. And that meant so many of my friends got fired, and we closed bureaus. Even today, there are fewer than half the bureaus that we had at NBC. The other networks are the same, domestic bureaus and foreign bureaus. More than half of them closed. So that would save money. To hold on to audience, and I won't say build audience because we're just losing it so rapidly, to hold on to what we had, we began to think about ratings for the first time. We never had thought, we news people, about ratings before. But our bosses began to think of them. And they had focus groups. What kind of news do people respond to? Because the idea was to broaden the appeal. And the focus groups, the demographic on evening news in particular, but the morning shows to some extent too, skews to older people. So the focus group said, well, they like health news, news about savings, and that's why even today there are all these departments on the news, your money, your health, fleecing of America, but they're designed to promote during the day and hold on to audience by broadening the appeal, and particularly to that demographic. My report card of where this stands today is that on the evening news, I think about the first 12, 13 minutes of it is old-fashioned hard news, and they do a good job of it, I think. After that, it goes to more of these, I won't call them fluff. I mean, it's not as light as fluff, but it is designed to appeal, as I say, to demographics. And so the rest of the newscast is that. In the mornings, the first half hour of those morning programs, I think, is pretty much crackling hard. And then you get into the Hollywood interviews and things like that as the morning shows go on. But they make money, the morning shows. They're good profit centers. Primetime TV, I think, is a wasteland. And I mean, I'm talking here 2020, Dateline. I should have put NBC first. Dateline. 2020, so as not to cast the blame on ABC, 48 Hours. Those programs have they started off serious and then they sort of scaled down, and nowadays they're an awful lot of warmed over decade-old murders and things of really no social consequence. So I think that's in bad shape. But they are, again, they make money because they're cheap to produce. They bring in a medium kind of audience, enough to make a good profit. And then cable TV in prime time is its own animal. That's probably what you think of when you think of the news changing and lightening up, because that's the panels, a lot of opinion, skew to the right or skew to the left. I mean, you got Bill O'Reilly and the other, Glenn Beck on Fox, but you got Rachel Maddow and Keith Olbermann on NBC on the other side, on the liberal side. And I think the managers are not so much into the ideology. They're just into whatever's going to hold on viewers and bring in money. And they have tried straight news in prime time on cable, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't bring in viewers. So that's why there's all that shouting and opinion. making on the evening on the primetime cable. But it's not going to change because it's here to stay. And my own attitude was that I didn't want to be a curmudgeon about it. I thought, well, you can't stop it. Go with the flow. But my attitude was that I just wanted to cover hard news, and pretty much was able to do that. And I think that hard news to me is the thing that I was the most proud of. Oh, I wanted to make the point that there is one factor I think that's very redeeming for television news, and that's that when a big story comes along, and I mean Haiti, Katrina, 9/11, I think the television reporting has been very, very good. I thought the reporting during Haiti was just superb. And they were quick on the scene. They were all over the story. And it's interesting, although we're losing audience like crazy, and particularly the youngest demographic, they say they get the majority of their news from the internet. But when a big story comes along, and they measure this statistically, people still, all demographics, television is the prime source of news on a big story. And most people say that they get the majority of their facts on a major breaking story like that from TV. Speaking of major stories, 9/11 was the most important story I had ever covered. And I want to tell you about my day that day. I was going up on Capitol Hill for a routine news conference early in the morning on some other subject, and the news came over the radio about the World Trade Center being hit by what I assumed was a private plane, general aviation plane, and so did all of official Washington. But I knew that would be my beat, my story as the aviation reporter, so I whirled my Jeep around and headed for National Airport. As I was pulling up onto the rooftop parking lot there, the news came over radio about the second tower now being involved. And I didn't have time to think, what could that be? It was so puzzling. I thought, is that debris that somehow sloughed over from the first building? Anyway, I raced into the Delta counter for the shuttle, and they said the airspace has just been closed in New York. So I raced back out. I thought, oh, I'll catch Amtrak. And as I say, it's a rooftop parking lot. The Pentagon is less than a half a mile from National Airport. And as I got out on the roof, there was this huge already column of ugly black smoke rising up, and only a plane crash could cause a column of smoke that dense. And I knew then that we were under attack, that something was awful. And so my job was to get back to the NBC station as quickly as I could, I mean the nearest live camera, which was our bureau. And it was not easy because the streets were filled with people who didn't know what was coming next for a crash. Was the White House going to be under attack, or Congress, the Capitol Hill? But I got back to the station, and as our aviation reporter, they counted on me to play a big role in all the live coverage all that day, because many of the early details came from American Airlines and United Airlines, which had been in communication with their crews back before the crews were killed, and had some details, and were able to confirm that their planes had indeed been hijacked. So I felt, even as horrible as the story was, a privilege to have played a part in keeping the public informed on that really awful day. And here is my story that night. As I say, we were live all day, so this is not fancy production. We then did a nightly news in the early evening at the regular time. But I only had about 20 minutes to work on my piece of it. My piece of it was just the aviation, so you don't see and hear the chaos at the World Trade Center site, because that had already been covered. This piece runs about 20 minutes into the newscast, but it details the aviation side, and it does have some good early reporting in there of things that later turned out to be true.
A major question tonight. How could they hijack 4 civilian jetliners in such a precise fashion? How did they pull all that off? Our aviation expert is NBC's Robert Hager, and he's standing by now in Washington as well. Robert?
Tom, 4 airliners turned into deadly weapons. There's a nationwide hold now on all commercial flights. That's the first time that's ever happened in our nation's history. And it lasts at least until midday tomorrow, and might last longer than that. And there are also some chilling first details of what may have been going on in those cockpits. But first, the facts.
The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, 767, with 92 on board. Supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south, directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767, with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 50 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m., American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It too, taken over and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well. But crashes short of whatever its intended target is. Comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I had to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching, and I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane made initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only two ways terrorists can sneak themselves or their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the hijackers must have disabled crews and taken over the plane's controls. More likely that than forcing a pilot with a gun in his head to fly right into the World Trade Center, for instance. Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, the controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this. There are several unconfirmed reports around that give little glimmers of what may have been going on in the cockpits. There's one from a controller in New Hampshire who says that a microphone was left on in the first plane of the day that was hijacked, that the pilot had his microphone keyed, so it was picking up the what was going on in the cockpit, and that the controller then, off at the control center in New Hampshire, heard a terrorist say in English, "Don't do anything foolish." Then after that, the microphone went dead. The transponder of the plane went off. That's a device that radios information out to the radar, so controllers could only watch the blip. They could no longer tell what altitude the plane was at. There were several cell phone calls from relatives on board, planes that reached their relative on the ground. One reported the terrorists had knife-like instruments. And there was one unconfirmed report that an American Airlines flight attendant actually reached her company to say that terrorists had killed the crew of her plane. Whatever else, we may know some more from the cockpit voice recorders, which could have survived those crashes and would give us an actual recording of what was going on for audio in the cockpits. Tom?
Thanks. So now I've come full cycle. 5 years ago, I retired at age 66 and moved back to Vermont. I wasn't tired. I wasn't burned out. I loved my job, loved my work, but it wasn't fair to my wife. I mean, news is by definition unscheduled. So we busted so many vacations. And then a typical evening, I'd finish the nightly news, and the Today Show would call, say, we want a story in the morning about so-and-so. It'd be a completely different subject. I'd call, honey'd have dinner ready, and I'd say, hold it, I got to do this, and I'll be home at 10. And then it would be 11, 11:30, and then get up early for the live shot to go with the pre-prepared part. So I said, what I'll do is I'll work very hard, and then when the time comes, when I reach retirement age, we'll blow the whistle and move back to Vermont, and that's what I did. I am proud to have been a journalist. I think it's a noble profession. I regarded it somewhat like being a teacher, which I also think is a very noble profession. I thought it's the most important thing for a reporter is to explain it to people, tell them what happened, and explain it to them very easily so they can understand it. And as a result, be better and more aware citizens. I know from coverage in the Soviet Union what it's like when the government controls the media and the people are easily kept in the dark and they have no idea what's going on, and it's easy to control the people. So I think that journalism is very important when it's practiced correctly, and thank goodness it's still practiced correctly some, if not all of the time. I still do occasional live shots from Woodstock. I try to do them from up here in Vermont when a major story breaks and they call on me, but I'd rather not go to the scene and step on the toes of the new generation of journalists that's coming along doing stories now on my beat. So I do that from Vermont just a few times a year. But the best thing about retirement is living up here. I thought that this morning when I'm skiing. I ski just about every morning. And I was at Suicide 6 in Woodstock starting off the day. And I think it in the autumn when you're walking along and looking at the unbelievable leaves. And I thought it tonight, just driving over here, you've got to cross two ridges. First, from Woodstock, you strike north, you go over Bethel Mountain, and then drop down into Rochester, and I could see that this is evening. Dusk is just coming on. See the spine of the Green Mountains as you drop down into Rochester, and then turn up toward the Middlebury Gap, and I could see the trails at the Snow Bowl looming up out of my windshield, and I pinch myself all the time and say, my God, I live in Shangri-La. So thank you very, very much for being a very attentive audience. Thank you.